trends that we're seeing. And then I'd like to zero in specifically on Amazonia and try to get a handle on what's going on beyond just CO2. So I'm assuming most of you have seen a graph something like this that goes back to the earliest global representations of temperature. Now, this is a temperature anomaly, so it's compared to the average with respect to 1951 to 1980 average. But you can see the individual data points, and this red line is a 5-year smoothing. You can see that there's this pronounced trend of getting warmer and warmer over time. And of course, that's really related to the fact that we've basically put a blanket on the Earth, the so-called greenhouse gas effect. I would really prefer that we call it like the space blanket effect, because a greenhouse really just inhibits convection, and a blanket's really what it does, but maybe that doesn't sound as, I don't know, scientifical. Anyway, so there's this profound warming with the adoption of fossil fuels, and that's a very strong global signal. And you can even see that the gray envelope over time has been getting narrower and narrower and narrower as we get better instrumentation. Here we're entering the satellite era. And so we're very confident about the accuracy of the data as we go forward. But that pattern of warming is not a uniform pattern. The pattern of warming that we've seen is strongly concentrated in the northern hemisphere, the land hemisphere. And you can see that some of the very cold parts of the world, northeastern Siberia and northern Canada, are seeing some of the warmest patterns. There's a little bit of warming in the tropics, not a whole lot. And there's a little bit of warming in Antarctica, also West Antarctic ice shelf, and a little bit of cooling, which is interesting because it's a very complicated fluid flow. So the heating pattern isn't a uniform warming pattern. And that's something that really gets me interested, because I'm interested in how people are modifying the tropics, the landscapes, their urban areas, things of that nature. And how do those actions that we do to our land surface locally, how does that fit together with this larger global trend? So when you look at the temperature trend, well, at least when I look at it, the first thing I think of is that, oh, it's very much the poles, the extremes of the planet, the North Pole and the South Pole. That's where the action is with temperature change. But if you look at rainfall, well, I couldn't find a really satisfying graphic because rainfall moves around all the time. But this is just simple rainfall anomalies during the Northern Hemisphere summer and Southern Hemisphere summer. And you can see that most of the rain happens right in the tropics. The rest, there's not much meaningful rain going on outside of those areas. That should give you a sense of how torrential the rainfall is in these parts of the world. In the Northern Hemisphere summer, a little bit of this band of rainfall called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or the ITCZ, can slide up here. Where's my mouse go? There it is. Can slide up here, can even get into southern Arizona, and there's a slight monsoon type system in the desert Southwest. In July and August, it kind of acts like a monsoon. The interesting thing is it doesn't really have a mountain chain like the Himalayas to push against. So you can see in India, in the Northern Hemisphere summer, there's this massive, massive amount of rain that falls on the subcontinent. So what I'm trying to say here is that there are two main ways that we talk about climate change, and that's really temperature and rainfall, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. And the temperature changes are a big deal at the polar regions, and the rainfall is a big deal in the tropical regions. And so I don't get accused of being selfish and being focused only on the tropics. I have this lovely little animation, come on, that looks at Arctic sea ice. And this data is collected through a variety of methods, both from satellites and from buoys and from ship sailing activities. So this data set starts in 1990, and the older ice, this older white ice, is here hugging the northern Canada coast, and younger ice is in the lighter blue colors. And let's just watch and see what happens. You can see most of the old ice has really fallen away. 2012 was a particularly weird year. Maybe you remember when it was 80 degrees in March in Michigan. And so you can see there's been a dramatic continuous shift because of the high temperatures in the northern latitudes. You can also look at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and they have daily updated information about the Arctic sea ice extent. And this is probably the most shocking to me. If you look at this is the extent, so the area of ice cover in the Arctic, with this gray line being the average amount for, here's December, January, February, March. And then this gray band is 2 standard deviations. And if you remember that spring of 2012, that's that green dotted line. You can see that it was very, very low amounts of sea ice cover. Well, we're at it again. We are below 2 standard deviations of sea ice extent. And so the warming pattern that I showed you in that earlier slide, it is dramatically taking over and altering the way that the Arctic functions. But so I acknowledge the Arctic exists. I just don't do much work there. The big deal then in the tropics, it's warm all the time, but the big deal especially for agriculture is precipitation. And this graph shows that if you look at global precipitation patterns, the anomalies year on year, you can see that there is a shift towards more rainfall, really noticeable after around 1947 or so. There was a little dip here in the 80s and 90s, and then it really took off even further. And we see this as a common touchstone around the world. Rainfall is getting more intense. There's more moisture in the air, and you can measure that with satellites. And the rainfall tends to persist for longer. And Jeff Andreessen here in the geography department has shown that in Michigan, we are having more of these wet following wet days than we have any time in the 20th century. Storms come here and they just kind of hang out for a few more days. So we see more proclivities towards flooding events. And right now we're at a very high level of the Great Lakes. These are very hard things to predict. I remember only 10 years ago, we were talking about the Great Lakes drying up. So clearly these climatologists are having a hard time predicting what's going on. So the precipitation changes that we see in that graph, you're thinking, well, where are those? Well, as I pointed out, most of the rainfall happens in the tropics. And if you look at the trend in precipitation, this is a little bit of a frustrating color scale, but the trends, a positive trend in precipitation. So, more rainfall, wetter, is red. I probably would have made it like green. And less rainfall is in blue. I probably would have chose like a dry color. But you can see that there is more intense rainfall here over the Indian Ocean, the maritime continent, very strongly, and some slight declines in this area here. And you see some different changes here, some increases in the Western Amazon, and maybe some declines off the coast of southeastern Alaska. You don't have to answer me now, but I'm going to give you a second to think. Does this pattern look like any pattern to you guys? If it does, if you said El Nino, you're correct. El Nino is a big driver in rainfall patterns. And El Niños appear to be becoming more and more frequent over time. And this is one of the big climate drivers that we have. This is particularly a big issue where land is over the equator, the three big deep convection spots. So the equator goes kind of through here. So there's deep convection in the Amazon. There's deep convection over the maritime continent of Indonesia, et cetera. And there's deep convection over the Congo Basin. Now, the Congo Basin is not showing a big trend in precipitation. This is based on a combination of satellite data and field measurements. But the Amazon is, and the El Nino related parts of the ocean certainly are. And if you need further evidence of it, you can look at how well these processes are correlated. This is just a correlation statistic about the number of wet hours and the hourly precipitation intensity. I don't expect you to dig into this too much in a sort of a broad talk, but take home the message that El Niños are really one of the big processes regionally that are involved with climate change. And so I'm going to show you some results that we've done here in our lab to look at how the Amazon is experiencing some changes. Some of them directly human caused and some through the elevation of CO2. Looking at all these patterns, you can also calculate drought severity. Now, I talk about rainfall a lot, and rainfall is important for agriculture, but being aware of drought is also a big issue. So the colors here that we're seeing are greens are more rainfall, so a healthier, lower chance of drought, and browns means it's a higher likelihood of drought in those areas. And if you remember the 1980s, way back in the 1980s, and Live Aid and the starving Ethiopian children, there are these interdecadal droughts that happen in the region of this here called the Sahel. And it looks like we're heading towards another one of those interdecadal droughts. You also see a strong drying in South Africa, and maybe you remember day 0 in Cape Town not too long ago, that they are really at the edge of where it's comfortable to live, to have enough water to be successful. So this is very patchworky, right? The southern Mississippi Valley looks like it's going to do well, but the parts of Western Canada look like they're going to see more drought. This part of the grasslands of Brazil, the Cerrado, it looks like it's going to see some inclinations towards drought. So when you talk about climate change, yeah, you can wave your hands and talk about temperature and rainfall patterns, but what really matters is where people live and what they experience individually. And that's why I look at this graph and I think this is great. This is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, listing all the forcings. And it says CO2 is, of course, the biggest radiative forcer. So this is scale down here at the bottom is in watts per meter squared. And CO2 is clearly the biggest of these bars on this whole chart. But some of them are well mixed, like CO2 and methane and all these gases. They are well mixed atmospheric components that happen pretty much everywhere around the globe. But people don't live everywhere. I live in central Michigan. And so things like land use and aerosols, these things matter a lot to me. And one thing is missing from here, and this really steams me off. So I think that land use beyond just albedo effects is really important. And we have evidence to show that it's not just changing the albedo of the surface that matters. It's also the way that the patterns of the landscape, the way the landscape changes and heats up. It matters very much how that happens. So I'm not trying to diminish the effects here, but I'm saying there's relatively little you can do as an individual. These are policy level changes like CO2 and methane, but at a smaller scale, you can go down to smaller levels. This is a graph of human appropriation of net primary productivity. And I put this in here to show how people use photosynthesis and how spatially distinct these things are. This is just the rough calculation, but this is, I like this one better. This is the in units of percent of how much local photosynthesis do you use. And some places use all of their local photosynthesis, 100%. Some places in orange here. But some places are in red, like the East Coast of the United States. They have to get their photosynthesis from Iowa, Michigan, Illinois, the corn states, the Corn Belt. And you can see that there are parts of the world that have a huge dependency on where photosynthesis occurs. So it very much matters locally where you are because of the impacts we have regionally. And those changes, they may not matter much to you if they're far away, but they very much matter to the people who are localized. So I want to emphasize that the role of land use is actually kind of a critical part of understanding climate change, rather than just saying, oh, it's just CO2. No, it's a whole bunch of things. It's whole systems of behavior. How many of you knew that Michigan had giant fires in the late 1800s? I know we're not in a classroom, but we cut it down. We cut down all of Michigan. It's crazy. Everything like on this side of the mitten from basically 127 west, look at the landscape out there. Absolutely denuded of all vegetation. And there were huge fires. And of course that had atmospheric impacts that had an effect on the moisture regimes. The soils dried out, there were massive fires. And the whole system was altered. Maybe not at a global scale, but it contributed to it. If you've heard of Rafael Trujillo, he was a dictator in the Dominican Republic, and he set aside private hunting lands over here in the Dominican Republic. In nearby Haiti, across the border, there were no restrictions on hunting, and you can see what effects the humans' simple policy changes had on the landscape. And this makes a very big difference. If you've been out in the hot sun in the tropics, you know it's a lot hotter over here, and it's much cooler in the canopy under the forest. Maybe you've heard about China. In China, under the Great Leap Forward, they tried to produce more timber by cutting down more trees. And as a result, much of China started to desertify. And it's only since about the 90s that China has started to replant trees to fight against having their own dust bowl. So again, land use change can locally affect your climate much more significantly than that abstract, far away CO2 induced warming. We did it here in the United States. Kansas had the Dust Bowl. My grandfather talks about how the sunsets were so beautiful during the Dust Bowl. Beautiful red and orange sunsets from all that topsoil being blown off the Great Plains. And it wasn't just there, it was also in other parts of the US. There was just terrible, terrible, unscientific agriculture. And the way we solved it, maybe you guys have heard about the USDA's pilot programs. It took decades to recover from that. It takes decades to change behaviors about how we manage our lands. Eventually, the pilot programs started getting people to adopt what they were trying to show, things like contour farming and cover crops. But it took a long time to change behavior. But ultimately, changing behavior is kind of the key to getting through all this. And rather than just point to like, you know, China's example or the case of Michigan or the Dust Bowl, you can see that soil degradation is a problem all over the world. Even here in the lush jungles of the Amazon, there are some little places of severe soil degradation all the way in the interior, largely due to changes that started with the end of Brazil's military dictatorship in 1975. One of the flaws behind the philosophy that we take about our land is that we want to make our land like it should be, rather than trying to take the land as it is and where we change. Las Vegas is my favorite example of this overwhelming desire to change the world to our will. Red in this image means agriculture or some sort of green leafy surface. And you can see in 1972, you can see everyone has their nice little English lawn in the middle of the desert. There's some golf courses and so forth. By 1992, you can see that we have transformed a desert into places with a lot of red, which means a lot of vegetation. And this has a very strong but very localized effect on the climate. So let's look at the Amazon. In the Amazon, there are a variety of different reasons to deforest. I think a lot of time people think logging is the big deal, but timber is not really the driving machine behind deforestation. It's really pasture. People want to have pasture for their cattle. The problem in the Amazon is that there's not a lot of nutrition in the soil. The soils are actually, they're kind of like red clay brick. They're kind of not very nutritious at all. So where are the nutrients? Well, they're locked up in the forests. And so you cut the forest down and you burn them. You get the nutrients out and you've got grass. That's really nice for a few years, maybe 3, 4, 5 years. These are soybeans in Pará in eastern Brazil. And then you have to bring in, whatever else is after the soybeans. So the cattle first, the soybeans next, and then a lot of times you abandon the land. And you can see here in this image, you can see that there's a lot of different heterogeneity in the landscape. There's this dark color here. The surface of the trees gets warmer. Over here, it's not as dark. So it's cool inside the forest. It's cool underneath, but it's hot on the very top. And so there's this differential heating pattern that develops. And this is happening, that pattern we saw in Bolivia. This is what it looks like in Brazil. They have a different legal system. So you can see how the roads move through. This road was built in around 1973. And you can see that there was a lot of deforestation that followed. By 1992, we have this very distinct fishbone pattern. And that you can see it also changes the structure of how the forest is laid out. So I think these land use changes matter just as much as the climate changes. I assume you guys have all been to the beach, right? You've been there in the afternoon and you start to feel this lovely breeze come in off Lake Michigan, right? It's called the sea breeze. Or if you're on the Atlantic or the Pacific, you'll feel this breeze in the afternoon come in. It's because hot air rises, sort of creates like a vacuum, right? That plume of hot air rises and it sucks in moisture underneath it and cooler air off the water. And so you get this lovely breeze going on. It's driven by differential heating of the surface. The surface here gets hot, but the sunlight here goes all the way down through the water and heats up the whole water column, but it spreads the heat out a lot more. Well, you get the same thing in deforestation of the Amazon, but we call it the vegetation breeze. So you cut down the trees here. Maybe it doesn't absorb as much sunlight because it's not quite as dark as that dark green forest. Okay, but all of that sunlight goes into heating. None of it goes into evaporation. And so what you do is you get this hot air rising up, and it entrains moisture that's transpired through the trees. And you can develop these localized, it's like the sea breeze, right? Except it's happening between forest and cleared land. And that is what we've been studying with my group in the Amazon. This is some work by my graduate student, Nafise Haktalab. She's great. She got this published just last year. And this shows the patterns of, this is legal Amazonia. It shows the patterns of rainfall change in annual precipitation. And you can see that there are some distinct patterns. This is not like we saw with the global change processes. The global change of CO2 and the temperature and the rainfall, those are there, but local processes appear to be dominating it. This is around the town of Porto Velho, which is a huge urbanizing area. There was nothing there 50 years ago, nothing. And now there's a huge city. And so we can see these distinct increases in the case of point D. You can see that there's been an increase in rainfall and then some dramatic declines in rainfall for A, B, and C on through here. And it's a very heterogeneous pattern, but it lines up well with where big cities are developing in the Amazon. And this is really related, this is really driven by human modification of the landscapes. This also extends to extreme events. You're like, hey, that kind of looks like the previous graph, doesn't it? It's got this sort of bullseye pattern around Porto Velho. This is dry season on the left and wet season on the right. But let me, let me back up. So you see sort of this ABC pattern. You kind of see the ABC pattern. There, it's persistent, not just in rainfall, but the way the rain falls. So this is an extreme event. So this is torrential rain. And it just comes thundering down really hard. And it's a very robust signal across a variety of times of year. Well, I wouldn't be me if I didn't talk a little bit about climate models. So we wanted to see if we can simulate how this process works. So we said, well, what if we cut down the entire Amazon basin? What would we see? What if we just left protected areas in there? And these are all the protected areas. And what we saw is that there's not a lot of moisture recycling in there. That would be this case D, extreme deforestation. Whoops. So that was a continental scale deforestation landscape that we put into our climate model, and we saw a big drop in rainfall. No big surprise, but that's not the interesting one. The interesting one is, what if we just kind of kept doing what we're doing and we ran this model out to the faraway year of 2030? And that's business as usual. Where do you think the roads are? You can probably guess. You can see right over here in Acre province, there's a road right there. Here's the Trans-Amazon Highway. And this is BR 163. So you can pick out the roads just based on where forest is removed from our model, because roads are a real big driver of deforestation. So we ran our climate model to see, well, and I tried it with both elevated greenhouse gases and current greenhouse gases to see if the effects were there. And what was really surprising is that, locally speaking, it was the land use change. It was the decisions that we make, the policy changes we make to govern our landscapes. Those were more important at the local level than the large background CO2. I'm not advocating burning CO2 and making the planet hotter. I want to stress the local effects of these decisions. The scale matters very much, very, very differently. And you can kind of pick out where the roads are again. There's like an increase in rainfall here and a decrease in rainfall here. That's from our vegetation breeze. Those cells get formed, the wind comes off from the east, the winds blow from east to west in the Amazon, and those cells form and they dump rainfall as they move. And you can see that happens here. Rainfall got picked up here, there's less rainfall here, and there's more over here. You see it again over here in Acre. The rainfall gets picked up, the disturbance gets kicked up by the road is right about here, and the moisture gets picked up and dumped somewhere else. So I guess you could say these guys are stealing these guys' rainfall. Now that would be an interesting political question to have to deal with. But what we're really seeing is that the road networks drive the vegetation breeze. That you're not just improving economic access, you're actually changing the local climate, in some cases very significantly. Now in the Western Amazon, it rains so much. A guy there who was from there once told me it either rains every day or it rains all day every day. So they're not going to run out of water. But over here, as you're getting towards the grassland areas, this is a transitional zone that if the trees don't get enough water, they'll die, and you'll get a permanent grassland expanding into the eastern part of the basin. And in fact, we're already starting to see some signs of that. And this map we found that you can kind of find the protected areas in here. The protected areas work, they preserve climate function. So if you don't protect it, it's not going to work. You have to have strong controls on land conversion across the basin. But you can contact me if you have more questions about that. I am almost out of time. Interestingly enough, you have all these perturbations driven by decisions about land use, and they affect local climate. But a series of experiments about 15 years old now, by some of my colleagues, they deforested the Amazon basin, and they tried to see where would you find significant impacts away from the Amazon basin on rainfall. And surprisingly, you can see that they found some pixels in the southern United States that were, anything that's got some color in here is significant. And if it's this one's sort of medium blue, so that's like 25% significant. So of course, deforestation in the Amazon affects rainfall in the Amazon. No surprise. But deforestation in the Amazon also affects rainfall in the southern United States. It's what we call a teleconnection. So there's a change in scale that I think is counterintuitive. If you deforest enough of the Amazon, not only will you permanently create an anthropogenic savanna that cannot grow back because it can't recycle the moisture, you're also exporting rainfall changes to faraway places, probably through some sort of Rossby wave transmission of disturbances and energy away from the basin because it's such a critical resource. I wanted to end with this little image here. This is some work by a guy I really admire. His name is Martin Scheffer. He's at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And he is a big believer in systems thinking, that to solve complex problems, you need to get above, you need to think above where you are into a new way of structuring things. And what I hope I've given you an impression of is that there are global scale processes and local scale processes, and we need some sort of middle ground. And I'm not anti-business, you know, I think people need to have jobs and need to live productive lives, but we're about to change things so that they'll be very uncomfortable. So in his systems thinking map, he came up with a way of calculating the suitability for humans, like not too hot, not too much drought, not too much extreme events. And so he calculated, and he did the current, and he did out to 2070. And so he did a difference map of suitability change. And the places that are in orange, he thinks by 2070 will be maybe not very habitable about 40, 50 years from now. And if you look at that, you know, look at how many people are living in Texas, the Carolinas. Look at the entire Amazon basin. He suspects based on, and then I looked at the data and the way he did the calculations, it's pretty much straightforward linear models. You know, if it gets too hot, you're going to die from sweating. Look at Saudi Arabia, look at Eastern India, look at Northern Australia. It's just going to be miserable. So it's not just limiting CO2, I think, is a noble and worthwhile goal, but I think there needs to be a host of changes to systems, of the way we consume food, the way we use energy, the way we spend all day on computer screens and don't go outside when it's 70 degrees. We need to change the way we operate so that we ourselves are more compatible with the ecosystem that we depend on for living. I have a whole bunch more I could rattle on with, but I thought I would stop here and ask for some questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Moore. That was an excellent presentation. I enjoyed it thoroughly. So
Thanks.
This this begins the question and answer portion of the session. So if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask, so I can kind of get the ball rolling a little bit. So what kind of struck me when you were through your presentation, you're stressing the difference between big, global effects, climate change, things like that, compared to like localized changes and how those can really impact the climate at the local scale. So what do you think is the greater, I guess, threat, for lack of a better word, long term? Is it localized changes or is it these big global events?
If I live in Fiji, I'm not real worried about Antarctic ice or Arctic ice. It really matters where you are. I'm going to use that as a springboard to show you another little thing I did. I did some climate simulations in East Africa. And I can back up a little bit. I wanted to look at effects from greenhouse gases, like you said, like the big picture stuff, and changes in rainfall and temperature and so forth with just land cover land use change effects. And then I wanted to combine them. And then I was kind of curious. I was like, well, which one's more important? Do I need to care about the CO2 or the land use change? And so I just looked at rainfall, but I just did a simple ratio. I was like, what was the change in the change in rainfall due to land use divided by the rainfall change due to the greenhouse gases? So of course, if the greenhouse gas effect is larger, it's going to be a number smaller than 1, right? Small over big, right? But if the land use change is more important, it'll either be a positive number, which is in blue, more rainfall, or a negative number, brown. And okay, so these places that have blue or brown, that means land cover change is more important than greenhouse gases for those areas. And you're like, well, that's only like 25% of the picture. True, but that's where most of the people live. Everyone lives around Lake Victoria and Nairobi and along the coast. So what you're asking is a really good, but a very complicated question to answer, because it matters very much where I am. How well my farm does depends on the weather very much here, and even the next farm over might be too different. And it's a scale question, right? Good question.
Thank you for that answer. I think that answered the question as best as it could be answered. So Joel and Kathy had a question. They asked, what do we as individuals here in Michigan need to do?
That's a good challenging question. The best thing we can do, I think, as individuals is work together to change our systems. Largely that means having a political voice and changing the way our businesses and our government operate. My mother is a wonderful person. She washes all of her plastic bags. She probably has plastic bags going back to the 1980s. She keeps her house very cold in the winter. She just puts on more layers. She is incredibly frugal. She recycles everything. And yet the world continues to do what it's doing. And so I take her as an example of even someone maximally as environmentally conscious as my mother is not having much of an effect. It's really, we have to create systemic change. And that just means encouraging businesses to be more environmentally friendly. That means finding a way to limit single-use plastics as much as humanly possible. That means getting people to stop playing games on their computers and go outside and play baseball. Change the way that all the pieces fit together. And I've seen some places that are clever about this, like some of the new urban designs that we're seeing in places like Seattle, like in southern China. People are really trying to build environmentally friendly systems. But we need a whole lot more of an innovation about that. So I don't want to give you anything other than push businesses and government to do better.
Excellent question. Thank you for that. Next question comes from Dottie. She asked, how do you keep from getting overwhelmingly depressed about all of this?
Well, I would like to thank my father. He passed away about 10 years ago. Goodness. He said, it's always darkest just before it gets pitch black. So I just assume every humans are going to be awful, and that if a few of us kind of just try to be cheerful amidst the barrage, you just kind of keep, kind of grit your teeth and keep going. That's it's growing up with a Stoic is a weird existence. I think it's something inherent, I think, in the way I was brought up. My kids get to hear about all this at home, so they know all the horrible things that are happening to the planet. And I probably need to stop talking about it so much, because they're pretty gloomy too from time to time. But I think the vibrancy of youth might be one of the ways to keep yourself buoyant. And being at a university, I get to interact with young people, and they are aware of the problem, and I think they have more optimism than I do. And so that's what keeps me going.
Thank you, Dottie. That was another good question. The next question comes from Dr. Waller, so brace yourselves.
Nathan, thanks so much for that. It's absolutely fascinating. From what I understand, one of the major impacts of climate change is going to be large-scale population movements in many parts of the world, particularly due to aridification. So how many of the climate models of local impacts of change land use factor in the very likely outcomes of the global level changes? Because the rapid urbanization, for example, as more people flee farmland which is no longer fertile in order to try and make a living in cities.
I feel like I just paid you to ask like one of the best questions. That's a huge issue right now. It's that we don't really have a good way of incorporating those human scale processes into the climate models. And a lot of people are like, why are the humans not in the climate model? And they should be, they absolutely should be. But we kind of put them in as a force or as a driver. So you're at a nascent point in time where the climate models are starting to adopt ways of doing that. But it's largely after the fact, like we'll use a historical pattern of urbanization and just project it forward a little bit. And it doesn't actually involve implicit dynamism, like the humans would respond in this way if you had this. And if there's 3 years of drought in a row, all the farming would stop and it would become rangeland. We don't have that in there yet, but we are very much aware of the problem and we're working on it. I feel like there was a second part of that question.
I think that covered at least what I intended.
Okay.
Thank you, Nathan.
Excellent question, Dr. Waller. Thank you. The next question comes from Susan. She asked, how do they predict the population change will be affected by the climate change predictions?
How do the population changes, say that again?
Basically, how do they think that, population change, presumably population growth, will affect climate change?
It is less an issue of population growth than more people wanting to live like Americans. That is the real big environmental driver. We are slowing down with population, and coronavirus has really put the brakes on population growth in the wealthier countries. The only places that are really aggressively growing in population are poorer regions of Africa and parts of the Middle East. But population growth has been slowing pretty dramatically since about the 1980s. And I know that the population bomb was a big deal when Paul Ehrlich came out with that book, but the world has changed in the last 40-ish years. So that is less of a driver than people trying to live at first world levels. Some people eat meat more than once a week. I mean, imagine, that's crazy, right? But it's true, and more people want to do that way. China is a net importer of food. China is terrified of running out of food. China is helping Brazil build a giant rail and water system over the Andes Mountains. That's crazy. To get to a system of rivers and dams and the thing that raises the boats, locks, that's what they are, and then trains to get the soybeans for domestic pork production in China and for the beef market, because Chinese people are more interested in eating beef, which is, you know, Western. And soybean is used for not just for feeding pigs, but for oils, for a whole host of things. And they're talking about, you know, this is a whole subcontinent, part of South America that is going to be devoted largely to feeding wealthier and wealthier Chinese people. So the problem is, I think, less that there are more kids being born, rather than the rich countries need to find a way to have less of an economic, food, and energy footprint. Good question.
Excellent question, Susan. The next question comes from David. David's asking about deforestation. You know, we've heard that it affects the world, but how severe is the deforestation issue? How does that relate to oxygen supply?
Good question. You probably have heard of the Amazon being the lungs of the world, right? I assume that's a common phrase. So the Amazon is very much a big producer of oxygen, but it is also a big user of oxygen. Because it's hot, the bacteria there are decomposing stuff. So the oxygen that gets created in the Amazon basin tends to also get used in the Amazon basin. Very little of it is actually exported to the broad atmosphere. Most of your photosynthesis that creates oxygen, where does it come from? Ocean phytoplankton. Something like 75%, 80% of your oxygen comes from the phytoplankton in the subpolar gyres, in the far up there in the cold waters off of England and off of Alaska and in Antarctica. Another big consumer, this is a real-time map of focus, smoke, for 2 days. So this is the fires in the Amazon. Well, this is sort of in the grasslandy areas, but they burn, there's biomass burning all the time in the Amazon basin. And that consumes quite a bit of oxygen locally and creates really bad air quality. And you see this seasonal burning of farmland all over the tropics. Every year they burn the fields to release the nutrients, and then they plant. So your oxygen levels are probably going to be okay, but if we start destroying the surface of the ocean in the cold parts where the phytoplankton live, that's when I would start raising a big ruckus.
Excellent question, David. Thank you. The next question comes from Michelle. She first off expressed that she thought the talk was very interesting, so she thanks you for that.
Thanks.
But then she also asked, do you have a sense as to what places on the planet we may see the greatest migration of humans as the result of climate change?
Okay, I gotta go with my boy Carl Sauer. Back in the 1930s, he said most of the reason people leave is not because of environmental degradation. They leave for social reasons. That social factors are what drive people to change. And I would say we're already starting to see some of it. Let's look at Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. You have salinification of soils by, you use the water, it's got a little bit of salt in it, and the water evaporates in these dry areas and the salt accumulates over time. And you're already seeing that damage on top of the conflict. So there's no reason to stick around. And so everyone left Iraq and then everyone left Syria. And now you've got Lebanon just continuing to crumble. So I think you're not going to see people leave their home place for a climate reason. It's going to be climate pushes people to the limit, and then some social trigger happens, like a war, like a famine, like a collapse of the currency, and then you see it. So if that's your framework, Where am I going to see people leaving, running away? Well, I would go back to Martin Scheffer's map. I would say, you know, you're gonna see people in the places where it's in orange in this map. You're going to see people, and you're already seeing it in the south of Sudan. You're going to start seeing people leaving the Amazon basin sometimes and going towards coastal Brazil, like Sao Paulo and Rio. You'll start to see it here in the Horn of Africa. I would argue that what's going on in Yemen right now is things were already kind of rough with the climate, and then the intervention there in their civil war is going to be the trigger, because there's just no more water. Parts of Western India and Pakistan, I would say, I would also look in those places. But generally, any place that's an orange on the map, that's not a country that doesn't have enough wealth to engineer its way out of, I think the South will be fine. We can engineer our way out of problems. But a lot of these places, they don't have that kind of money.
Excellent question, Michelle. Thank you for that. The next question comes from Judith. So I'll go ahead and let her ask the question if she'd like to.
You're muted. I need to.
Judith, I think you're muted. Yeah.
Did that work?
Great.
Yeah.
Whoa. I'm very interested in the role that our search for more and consistent energy does to populations. I mean, look at the dams that are being built against really good advice in Brazil for more electricity. And I'm also thinking of the one that is being built on the Nile right now by Ethiopia. And when you bring in more and more and more energy, you're going to have population shift toward that because they want a better lifestyle. What do you think that search for energy is really going to do for what you've laid out here today?
I think big projects like the not the Aswan Dam. What is the one in Ethiopia called?
It's a brand new one. They haven't
Yeah.
even opened it yet. I
It's
don't
huge.
remember. Yeah, it is very big. And I think they're getting a lot of assistance from China.
That one in Belomanchi, I think
Yes.
that's going to be less of a useful strategy because it involves a huge amount of capital and it doesn't tend to benefit most of the people. It tends to go towards the wealthy and connected. And you can already see that there's a lot of distrust around those things. I think alternative solutions like in-stream turbines are going to be a big deal. I think they found a new kind of perovskite in Russia that makes better solar panels. I think you're going to start to see better solar panels, modular power, better batteries, the ability to move power around using superconductors. I think we're gonna see continued innovation in that sector.
But it really wipes out indigenous populations, the Belamonte particularly.
Yeah, it really does. And that's why I think those large type dams really are not going to be feasible over the long term. I think there's going to be political disagreement about it, and you're going to have to clean it up in 30 years, and that's going to cost a lot more money than if you had just done it right in the first place. I think
The Three Gorges Dam is a good example of that. Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Sorry, I was muted. Excellent question, Judith. Thank you. The next question comes from Mary Ann. She asked, are there any studies or research devoted to figuring out how to get the public at large's willingness to make changes that will benefit our planet? Like, how do we convince people to adopt these attitudes you're talking about?
Changing behaviors is the most effective way to shift systems, but changing behaviors is also extremely hard. And I would say mothers are probably the greatest source of changing behavior that the world will ever see. So if we can empower moms, I think that would be a big shot in the arm. Dollar for dollar, putting money in the hands of mothers for healthcare is the biggest intervention for improving a society's well-being. That's from something Bill Gates funded and found out. And so I think about, well, if you treat the Earth as a planet, as a patient, then I think you just need to find a way to educate mothers, especially in some of these poor countries. They have no education. Give them the resources to make useful decisions, and they will make those good decisions. The men, not so much. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in Africa, and the gender differences in decision making are profound. If you invest even a little bit with the moms, like with Jeff Sachs's millennial villages in Kenya and Uganda, it pays for itself. But you also have to bring in the education. You have to make sure everyone's got enough food, and you have to give them the education. And once you can do that, they will be in a good position to change the behaviors of the next generation.
Excellent question, Marianne. It's very good. I had a question that I typically struggle with whenever we discuss climate change, and I haven't really heard someone, I think, adequately answer this question, in my opinion, yet. So maybe I'll put that burden on you, Dr. Moore, if you don't mind. But I think climate change, and when you're talking about, when you're discussing adopting these new systems, adopting these new attitudes about how we should be living and what is the best way of life, I think there's an ethical argument to be made that, the Western world, as you can call it, North America, Western Europe, places like this have benefited from, decades of abusing the earth, essentially, and they now have their position in the world as the result of these decades of abuse of the environment. And so, who are we to essentially go to these, developing countries and say that you can't do what we did, that what you're doing is somehow wrong, and what we did was perfectly okay at the time? So, like, how do we tell the developing world that they can't do exactly what we did?
I think you come from a good ethical standpoint. I think that's right. You can't say, well, do what I said, not what I did. And China, that's the argument China uses on why they're able to burn so much coal. But I don't think historically that we have been moving that way. I think we've really had a big shift, especially, starting around maybe the 60s, of rather than sort of this dominating mindset towards, saying what are some alternative solutions, and rather than forcing poor countries to do something, it's like, here are some resources. And granted, there have been many mistakes, like with USAID. If there's a famine, we show up and we deliver a whole bunch of food. Well, the local farmers who are able to produce food, they've suddenly lost all their market share. So there's ways to be charitable and helpful, and we're learning how to do that. But we're also a pretty big force in the world for trying to get people to diversify their energy sources and their food systems. We donate a lot of seed. We set up a lot of improved food systems. We are working on energy diversification schemes for a lot of different countries. At least the United States is, and other countries are starting to get on board. And it's more seen as a partnership. Now, I'm partners with some researchers at the University of Dar es Salaam. Amos Majule is one of them. He's a big believer in, like, hey, let's get together and you bring some of your trained people over, and we'll send some of our trained people over to you, and we'll talk about ideas. So there is, I recognize where you're coming from. Yes, there is some dominant behavior from the wealthy countries, and that's not a good solution. But there's a lot going on at the ground level that I think is worthwhile and headed in the right direction.
Thank you, Dr. Morton. Appreciate that response. Looks like the chat's been cleaned out. Is there anybody have any nagging questions or comments, concerns, dreams, aspirations? Always welcome here.
Nathan,
like
can I
we might.
jump in with another? We've spoken a little bit about this in the past. What is the advice that you would give now in terms of persuading a skeptic, particularly about climate change, that this is something to be taken seriously?
I wouldn't talk to a skeptic about climate change if I knew that they were that way. I would talk to them about values and what they want the future to look like and how we can work towards that common goal. You're not going to change their minds. Okay, my cousin's husband, he's a good man, but he lives in East Tennessee and he is very much of that region. I'm very much of that region. I just had a different set of parents. And he said, I took a class and I saw them showing me a bunch of data about climate change. I seen all them graphs. He's seen the data and he's not willing to do that. So there's no point. I would rather say, well, what should we be doing to make the world healthier with less pollution, more people working together, less child mortality and child nutrition deficiencies. Talk to him about the issues that he does care about, and work on the moms to raise the next generation with more information. Because I'm not going to change his mind. That's a great question, John, but I've lived it, and I guess maybe I am a terrible explainer, but I've ran into too many brick walls that way.
Good question, Dr. Waller. There's still no question in the chat, so I guess I'll ask another question that Dr. Waller's question kind of sprung on me. Me personally, this is just my relatively uneducated opinion. I think the emphasis on climate denialism is a little overplayed. Like, I don't necessarily know how big an issue it is, people denying the facts of climate change, as much as people just refusing to change in the face of facts. And so that's what I often see. Like, a lot of people, like, if you say, do you think climate change is real? I think the vast majority of people will say is yes. Now, do they want to adopt the attitudes and ways of life that you were discussing earlier that would solve the problem? I think that's a different question entirely. So I guess, like, hoping you could perhaps comment on that.
I'm a big believer in getting business to be a part of all these solutions. And I think if people see that the best way forward is to make these changes to the environment, to the way we manage the environment, that also make us happy and wealthy, then they're like, all right, fine, you get your lower CO2, but I still get to have my rocket ship, right? We don't want to all live in huts with, eating gruel every morning. And there's a fear there that you have to acknowledge. So it's the tone I try to take is like, let's build things that are more systematically comprehensive. Like, no one said in the 1900s, they didn't say, oh man, I want a car. No, they would just say, I want a faster horse. They didn't. You get to jump to a different system of thinking, a different way of valuing things that incorporates ecosystem values more implicitly, because the dollar doesn't really do that right now.
Thank you for that. The next question is from Arthur. He asked, are there cold territories that are becoming more habitable as the planet warms up?
Absolutely. I've heard in Michigan, it can be up to 60 degrees in March. And that, to me, Michigan, growing up in the South, Michigan was just uninhabitable. But there are, there's some great videos by the BBC and Deutsche Welle about Siberia, about how Siberia is becoming this huge farmland, especially out near Krasnoyarsk, near Lake Baikal. Suddenly they can grow crops there that they've never grown before. The permafrost is melting in some places, and that makes the roads and bridges fall apart, but you're going to have grassland for cattle there. In southwestern Michigan, St. Joe County and Berrien County, you can now grow 2 crops of soybeans. 2. Couldn't do that 40 years ago. Farmers won't say anything about it, but they're quiet all the way to the bank. Canada's starting to see longer growing seasons. Places in southern Argentina that were unavailable for animals to graze, now the animals can graze there because they won't freeze to death. So you are starting to see some of those lands. It's mostly in Russia, though, mostly in uninhabitable, well, not uninhabitable, but uninhabited and very remote parts of eastern Siberia.
Can I ask a question on population? I was wondering, I've been thinking recently about how many people can planet Earth support? I think I had heard something like 500 or 1,000 years ago, there were 500 million people on Earth, and now we have 8 billion. And I keep thinking, well, there must be some limits to resources, even under the best climate or conditions.
Our good friend Thomas Malthus, you're absolutely right. Locally, we sometimes run out of food because food cultivation, we're getting about 1% efficiencies in yield every year. And people don't tend to grow linearly, they grow exponentially. So I don't think we know the upper bound because we keep getting better at farming. And I would rather we not find out where that limit is. But I would like to remind you of Amartya Sen. It's not so much that we don't have enough food. So we have enough food to feed everybody in the world easily, but we have a hard time getting the food to the people. It's really a social systems problem, maybe a supply chain problem, more than it's an actual cultivation problem. And some people want to have, steak every day, and there's a huge amount of energy and water and grains that go into making steak. And so if you can just get people to eat meat less than 7 days a week, that would free up a lot of resources and also save your health and your money too. I think there's a lot of room to grow, but I hope we don't get near that boundary. But I can't really answer your question though, because we keep getting better at farming. So it's a moving target, but it's a great question. It's a slippery Malthusian question.
Thank you, David. That was a good question. Another question from Joel and Kathy harkens back to your days on Fiji. They asked, in the Fijis, is there still a great divide between the native Fihana and the people who are from India?
Yes. They had a democracy there for a while, but after I left, the people who were brought over as indentured servants in the 1880s from India, their children are still there, but their names are not recorded in this book that records their ethnicity, the Volani Kawambula. If you are ethnically Fijian, your name goes in that book, and you can prove your genealogy going back 200 years. It's kind of reminds me of the Icelanders and their really good genealogical records. If your name is in the book, you get lower interest rates. You can serve in leadership posts in government. You can own certain types of land. There's all these things you can do. But people who are ancestors of the Girmits from India cannot do that. If you're Chinese, European, you cannot do that. So this came to a head when a person of Indian descent was elected prime minister, I want to say 2005, and the military took over. And it's been a military dictatorship ever since. And I met the old prime minister, and he was a nice guy, Sitiveni Rambuka, but you could clearly tell that there was a line you could not cross when he was talking to people who are not Fijian. So it was it's still very stratified.
Good question. Marianne had a question, and I think that'll probably be the one that wraps this up tonight. So Marianne asked, is there a book you can suggest that will be helpful in changing or improving our own approach to doing work will benefit our planet?
I ran across a book, I think it's called The Future Earth. I think that's the name, the title of it. Future Earth, the future of our Earth. Yeah, The Future Earth by Eric Holthaus. And I think he gives sort of an optimistic picture of and John is very excited. Have you read it, John?
No, it's because Tyler and I were both going straight to Google, and normally he beats me, but that's the first time I got in before him.
Anyway, really good book. Gives you a good perspective on, even if the system does not change, there are some things you can do that will make your life better and will coincidentally be good for the planet, which is kind of, I guess, all you can hope for if we can't get big political change. I, for one, think it's a bit too late to see to limit the big changes that we're going to see. The CO2 tends to hang out in the atmosphere for about 100 years, your average CO2 molecule. So it's going to take a long time to suck out the stuff we've already been burning. And we kind of missed the boat back in 2010. That was really the drop dead date. So we're into no man's land. The Arctic is going to be different. Greenland is already starting to melt and slow down the Atlantic meridional oceanic circulation, overturning circulation. So we're going to see those things happen. They've already started. And we're just going to have to sort of adapt. Gloomy note to end on.
No, that was, despite the gloomy note to end on, it was overall a very good talk, Dr. Moore. I think we all appreciate it. So if we could all give one last round of applause, Dr. Moore, over Zoom.
Thanks very much.
Nice, nice visual clapping. So that more or less wraps up our session today. I'd like to thank both Dr. Moore and everyone else who attended for coming today. You know, these sessions would not be possible without y'all. So it's, you know, it means a lot to both me and Dr. Moore and all the other moderators when y'all come out and support us. And so, is there anybody that has any announcements they'd like to make before we all log out?
One very quick announcement. First of all, again, thank you, Nathan. That was a chilling ending, but that was such a richly informative talk and Q&A. So thank you. The one final announcement is, please come back here same time next week when there are 3 members of the Scholars Program who will be presenting on their research. In fact, all 3 are moderators. Emily Saxon, who you'll be quite familiar with, Wisdom Henry as well, and somebody called Tyler. So please do come back next Tuesday.
All right. Thank you all for coming.
Good night all. Bye-bye. You know, Tyler, I've read a lot about climate change, but there was something about the way that Nathan finished that just suddenly left me cold. But I think we've lost Tyler. How are you, Jennifer? Oh, you're muted.
Go.
Oh, there you go.
Generally, I'm fine, but like you, I'm pretty shaken by what I've learned, but fascinated in bringing the problem down to earth, so to speak, and not just thinking in terms of what have we done to the environment, but what are we doing here on earth, how roads work, how trees work, all of that stuff. Yeah. I'd not known before.
Yes.
I find that fascinating.
Yes, yes. You know, he's pretty much doubled how much we have to worry about by doing it, but it was at least, yeah, I definitely learned things I hadn't thought of before.
That's why I'm stuttering as I'm trying to answer your question.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I definitely feel a drink is in order at this point.
Yes, but not from a plastic cup, be sure.
No, definitely not. But it also did occur to me that I suppose very soon they'll be growing fine wines in Northumberland again. Actually, I'm not sure whether you could ever do it in Northumberland, but in the medieval period, you could certainly grow them in. I think in York, you could grow wine.
I wonder if he could in Cornwall.
Oh, I would have thought so. I
Well,
don't know. Maybe it's the land is too exposed to the wind.
that's true. Yes. Well, I'll suggest to my cousins, if you could get the vines going, I'll visit you as soon as I can.
Yeah. You make Cornwall even lovelier. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, it is glorious. Where are you from? Where did you grow up?
All over the place. Originally Lancashire, but then my parents slowly moved south, and my accent became increasingly confused over the following 20 years.
I understand what you mean by that. Yes. Are you from Australia? No. Are you from Germany? No.
Where are you from in the UK?
Cornwall.
Oh, you are from Cornwall. Yes. Okay. Yes.
I was thinking during the lecture of the times I've spent in Ireland, just thinking in their food shops, their supermarkets, you have to pay if you want a plastic bag.
Yeah, right.
And
Yes.
I sort of want, I know the bag's going to break, but why don't you put more in it?
Yeah, yes.
Think what an impact that would have here.
Yeah, so yeah, Britain is the same way now. I think everywhere I've been in Britain in the last few years, you've had to pay for the bag. My understanding is that there are some US states, or at least counties, where they passed legislation to prevent legislation demanding. So they passed legislation to prevent stores from charging for bags. It's just nuts.
Oh, I bet Georgia was one of the first to do that.
Oh no, I'm sure, absolutely.
Yes, so angry with Georgia.
Yes. That's my definition of freedom. Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy, but yeah. Right, well, I better go down and
Serious, it really is.
Yeah.
Fascinating. My mind is always spinning when I go to the leave button. So thank you. That's been an awful lot of work on your part.
It's not so bad now. Because we're not worrying about the complicated registration process that we had originally. I mean, the work is basically just one shot of lining up faculty. I mean, there was a difficulty in identifying faculty who can speak at the right kind of level.
Right.
I thought Nathan did a really good job. I thought there were only a couple of things that were going to be a struggle. But yeah, I think we've been really fortunate with the faculty so far.
Oh, I do too. I think you've made excellent choices. Yeah.
I hope. Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be a bottomless pool, so we'll see what happens. I'm thinking at the moment that we should team up with another group at U of M, and so at least we can then, combine forces. But yeah, I think we've got at least another year before we need to worry about
Good.
Sustainability. So,
well, thank you. And then maybe we can all meet in person.
well, I know, absolutely. I was thinking, yeah, it'd be wonderful to have these. I'm not quite sure where the good venues would be. There's a lovely room actually at the People's Church, which there's good parking and it's comfortable, so that would be an option. But yeah, I think maybe I'll throw that out next time. When we can do this in person, where should it be?
That's right. Let the audience do some of the hunting for you.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, meanwhile, let's hope you and I and your wife can get together and come over for a drink here.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'd love to. Absolutely. Yes.
A teeny bit warmer.
Yeah,
Well,
sure. Yeah. And I'm still unvaccinated, but I will be immune by the end of April, I think it is, or very, very early May.
It is a wonderful feeling. I was surprised just how happy I was.
Yes, yes. No, I mean, I adore, I'm a historian, but I adore science. In fact, I much prefer science. And, you know, my love for it has redoubled. I think it's just extraordinary what they've achieved.
I agree, yes. So if only we could get everybody to join in.
Yes. Yeah, but let's definitely do that. Yeah.
I love it.
All right. Good night. Bye-bye.